Hi guys, we should cover this week the debate about methodology, the quantitative and qualitative methods. And the first thing we can highlight, like in theoretical terms, to what extent, this debate, these kind of heated debates about quantitative and qualitative methods did take shape in the political science as a field of discipline. So basically, it's not like the starting point, but perhaps like this kind of heated debate started with the publication entitled "Designing Social Inquiry: Scientific Inference in Qualitative Research" in 1994. Um, so it's by King, Kuhn, and Verba. So the basic thing here, it offers like implicit assumption like that the large end researchers have kind of superiority or superior tools for answering research problems or solving many methodological problems in order to to specify or to identify the research problem or to specify the theoretical framework or the appropriate the proper theoretical framework for to answer or to analyze or to explain the research problem or to solve the research puzzle, and then to test the hypothesis and retest and refine the theory. So it's basically the quantitative from by definition, like the quantitative research, it it actually depends mainly on like numbers, how to construct data sets or to analyze, uh, numbers. So basically, they count heavily on statistical models in order to reach kind of accurate findings and to conduct like rigorous methodological research. So they not only like regression model, but they depend mainly on constructing or analyzing, numeric data. Like for example, like if you have like a public opinion survey, and you need to examine the relationship or to explain the relationship between the degree of trust in political parties and level of protest or participation in protest. So if you have like public opinion survey, or you conduct these kind of surveys by yourself, so you depend mainly on like set of numbers or equations in order to relate these kind of observable data to underlying kind of parameters that take on values, and these values relate to could be interlinked to kind of descriptive and causal patterns in the real world. Like for example, like the degree of trust, and you have like answers like range from 1 to 4, like absolutely trust to absolutely do not trust, and then you give kind of numbers to these answers, and you rank this in order from 1 to 4, and then you need to examine the relationship between this degree of trust in political parties and the outcome variable under investigation, which is like participation in protest or demonstrations. So basically, you establish or you construct your model, the statistical analysis or the statistical model, on kind of assumptions that there is kind of, if people like do not trust the political parties or existing like political channels, they would resort to extra systematic participation in order to articulate their demands. So it's basically an assumption, and you can like like quantify some variables in order to be measurable, and then you can test this relationship in order to establish kind of causality. So this is like the next step, how to formulate hypotheses and to test these hypotheses. It's basically how to determine if your argument is valid or not, and then to make a causal inference. It's basically how to use the facts or these kind the available facts or data in order to learn something about facts we don't know. So this is very essential in order to establish, this kind of causal effect or causality. But it's not like that precise, in quantitative analysis, because sometimes, as I mentioned, it would establish kind of explanation or correlation between distrust in political parties, for example, and participation in protests or demonstrations. But it didn't say anything about, like, the causal mechanisms, how, like, this kind of distrust in political parties would push individuals or people in order to resort to these kind of extra systemic or contentious practices. But the actually, like, proponents of or advocates of quantitative research methods, they do believe, in this kind of large N, like this kind of um, measurable hypothesis testing, and introducing kind of measurable variables in order to establish kind of causal relationship or causal effect between different variables, and this would enable researchers to generalize the findings. So that was, like, this is actually the main still, like, the main target or the main aim of quantitative researcher. And this is, like, this kind of advice, the designing social inquiry, offered to researchers in the field. And they do care mainly about, causal inference and counterfactuals, as I'll explain, shortly. So this kind of the debate triggered by designing social inquiry led to, like, some other reactions from different scholars, that they do believe in or advocate, the other kind of methodological tools, or the defend other methodological tools, like qualitative research methods. The most prominent, reaction towards, the quantitative superiority thing, or the scientific superiority of the quantitative methods, that actually triggered, some sort of understanding that the other methodological tools, lack any kind of accuracy, or cannot be labeled as kind of methods. So that's why they have, like, this edited volume, and they had, like, old edition, and this one, like, the new edition, and assigned like 2 chapters from this book. By definition as well, like, the qualitative research methods, they actually count mainly on like written, verbal, and visual content, like interview data, archival data, participatory observation, this kind of, like, the different kind of data collection, in order to establish this causality, and this to establish, this causal inference between different variables. So they have, like, different they led to kind of debate about the advantages and disadvantages between or of the quantitative and the qualitative methods, in order to strengthen, or in order to have kind of tools in order to make this causal inference. So for them, like, it's kind of a trade-off. It's okay, like, they don't rely mainly on the large N, because, like, depending mainly on large N, or, like, drawing together different cases or different observations, so researchers would look over the context, or some contextual knowledge. So so they care mainly about this kind of knowledge, emanates from the context, and they rely mainly on the different kind of techniques or tools in order to make this causal inference. Basically, process tracing. We're going to see. I'm going to explain this in some detail next week. So basically, it's process tracing and within case analysis. So, for example, you need to know, like, why this. Back to the example on the political parties and social protest, for example, why like country A experienced some revolutionary change at some point, and then led to, like, after that, like the same, like, political actors or political parties that previously participated in, like, these kind of contentious practices or revolutionary actions, um, resorted to kind of acquiescence or political compliance to play within, the framework of the polity. So researchers that they adopt, this kind of techniques or these kind of quantitative tools, they might, resort to interview data in order to have, like, in order to have a comparison between, like, different historical periods within a particular case, in order to see what pushed people or motivated people to revolt at some point, and then they adopted, kind of different political ideology or political outlook in order to advance their to articulate their demands or to advance their goals. So they highlighted, kind of problems like designing social inquiry or largely in people or researchers didn't pay attention to, basically the king and verba. So they focus on, like, different like steps or different, like, components of the research design, quantitative analysis or the framework introduced by designing social inquiry actually overlooked. So they focus on, like, the causal inference. For them, like, from, like, this kind of observational data or the data set, the numbers or the measurable variables, these kind of collection of different numbers or scores, it actually it sometimes, it focus the data set, the different data sets focus mainly on sample of cases, and sometimes, they do miss, some data, and missing data is, like, a serious problem, in order to make, this kind of inference, causal inference, or to have, like, a rigorous causal effect between different variables. And what parameter actually to include and what not to include it's another, methodological problem, the which is called kind of omitted variable bias. So it's actually, it's not like, it's not about accuracy or how to have, like, a precise, research design. You have to adopt a kind of all research tools, should be subject to kind of critical evaluation, because, like, they have, like, this conceptual this kind of causal inference on observational data. It carries, some problems regarding missing data or omission, of some variables. Conceptual or formation as well, it's integral part of any research design. We spoke about this in some detail, like, last week, like, how to specify, like, clear concepts, and to make, like, a clear distinction between the concept under examination and other similar concepts. And this kind of conceptual formation is very important, and in order to reduce it to a measurable element or dimension, it's kind of problematic. And sometimes it doesn't really capture, like, it's like the concepts and measurements are, kind of interlinked or interrelated. So it's very difficult to make sure, like, these concepts capture exactly what you want to measure. For example, if you need to examine, like, democracy, so what kind of element or dimension you're going to focus on? For the quantitative people, they might focus on, like, the turnout rate, the existence or of universal suffrage, for example, the extension of the suffrage, for example, the competitiveness of the elections. So it's kind of, sometimes they are kind of mutually exclusive. If you focus on one dimension, So you have to, like, to pass over, other dimensions. Um, that's like this problem, like, the quantitative researchers, pay attention to. So the conceptual, the concept formation and measurement, they are like, the framework, the quantitative framework, doesn't pay, much attention to. Causal inference, in case studies, um, is is kind of different. um, I'll explain this in some detail next week, but for now, it's kind of for causal inference in quantitative research design or in case studies. They focus on some kind of deliberate selection. For example, most likely or least likely cases. If you have, like, a case that, like a most likely case, to have, like, this causal relationship between X and Y, or a least likely case, of the, in order to test the hypothesis about the hypothesis about the relationship between X and Y, or a deviant case, like, the conditions, the scope conditions are, some conditions are there, but it's kind of deviant. Like the causes, the existence of the cause didn't actually lead to the outcome uh, you expect to have. Um, and again, like these kind of methods of agreement and difference, most similar system design or most different system design, the the case study, the causal inference in the case study literature actually turned, what designing social inquiry said, turned it on its head, kind of. So because of, like, the quantitative data, they need to dilute, these differences, or to put, these differences um, within the framework of the large N, so they don't pay attention to these differences or the contextual knowledge between cases. Um, so behind, this kind of accuracy or rigorous research design, um, some other, like, potential problem of losing, this kind of context or conceptual accuracy, or the context or different, value of causal effect or causal relationship between X and Y. For quantitative research methods as well, researchers do care about the what we explained before about, on inductive analysis. So inductive analysis for quantitative researchers, um, like the inductive analysis would help out with the, like, achieving or establishing kind of new causal inference between two variables, and to generate it would help out with generating new ideas. In qualitative research, it's somehow like researchers would be kind of dismissive uh, in order to test, the some of the hypotheses against, the same sets of cases. They made, like, causal inference about these cases before. The most, like, famous example was the Pathologist of Rational Truth Theory by Green and Shapiro. So what they said something about, the methodological issue or of the inductive analysis, and how, like, how qualitative researcher or this qualitative research design would help researcher to be kind of dismissive of kind of new kind of causal inference between different variables. So again, like the main assumption, the main kind of the main logic of the rational truth theory is, like, actor A acts the way they did in order to maximize benefits, and we know, like, we must be true because we see the actor, did this in action. So it's a kind of a combined, factors of self-interest or perhaps, like, altruism pushed political actors or pushed like actor A in order to behave in a certain way, and this would always this kind of combined effect of factors would give us the right prediction all the way through. So we call this kind of tautological argument, and it must be true, all the time. So it's kind of unfalsifiable. So they would favor, to maintain, this rationality by making what they call like ad hoc assumptions or modifications to the motivational models. So from let me explain it in a simple way. So from like, observing or from observable cases, these cases will be used in order to test the modeling or the contextual, the context of the individual preferences. So instead of introducing kind of a new causal inference or new hypothesis and to generate, new kind of to give like the old theory kind of hard test, so they add like what they call ad hoc assumption, but Green and Shapiro claim that these models are largely kind of post hoc. If you remember when I give an example about, if you have like, data set, for example, and you kind of, you thought about, you established kind of relationship between two variables, like, about like level of education and political participation, gender and political participation. And then after like, noticing, this kind of interlink between the two variables, then you have like these kind of observable cases in order to have your, in order to test your model about to what extent like the level of education affects, the political participation, for example. And you already like, did know this from the data set you looked into. So this kind of, if you have this would be like if you have a theory and you notice, this, and you try to examine this kind of observable cases, you use these kind of observable cases to test, the model or the relationship you need to examine or you need to investigate. So your model will be kind of largely kind of post hoc. So I'll explain, this in some detail by offering, some example, some clear examples. So here it's kind of this kind of methodological divide between quantitative researchers and qualitative researchers, and you have like two prominent, scholarly works, that tried to bear on, these kind of debates about quantitative and qualitative divide, and they ended up like, advising, to have like kind of mixed methods in order to make use of the advantages of the both methodological tools. So it's actually, there is always like a trade-off. If you need like, more accuracy or more kind of conceptual nuances, so you might resort to case studies, or if you need like, more knowledge about context or more accurate conceptual framework, so you might resort to this qualitative research design. If you need like, generalization, if you do care about generalization and like establishing, a relationship between or correlation between X and Y, between explanatory variable and the outcome variable in a large N, so you might need to adopt, this kind of qualitative research methods. So it's always like it entails kind of a trade-off between like generalization and context, like conceptual nuances or accuracy and generalization as well. So both like methodological tools would offer some theoretical insights into the same issue we need to investigate or we need to examine. So I choose like one article that largely like deployed quantitative tools in order to examine the relationship between Islam and authoritarianism, and we will see like what kind of conceptual problems or measurement issues the author tried to raise, and how actually he did overcome or he tried to fill the gap, or to come up with different measurement, and to try to or he actually introduced some other alternative explanations. And both like quantitative and qualitative research methods or research designs, they have some problem of ruling out or relegating some of the rival explanations. If you have like the literature already establishes the relationship between x and y, and you need to introduce a different variable, so how can you rule out these kind of rival explanations? So we're going to see how the how Fish actually in Islam and authoritarianism introduced the formulated a problem and introduced like this quantitative research design, and what kind of methodological issues he raised, and how he responded or how he actually solved some of the methodological problems, and finally how he introduced one new variable or kind of um, new hypothesis in order to or provisional theory, actually elements for provisional theory in order to be examined in the future. um, so he does care about Islam and authoritarianism, and the main question why like the predominantly Muslim countries are authoritarian. There is kind of a democratic deficit in Muslim societies. Um, so he tried to dismiss or to rule out the rival explanations by saying like some studies mention something about the inclination of Muslim societies to violence, and he actually he ran like some statistical models or regression analysis in order to compare Muslim societies with Catholic societies, and actually it was kind of a coincidence or a correlation between the high level of violence in Muslim societies, and this kind of correlation doesn't explain why Muslim societies are not democratic. And it's not like the problem of like secularism as well. Like the Muslim societies are less secular than other societies, and he again like he compared like Muslim societies with Catholic societies, and it's not a problem with the religion per se, um, because like some other countries or some other religions actually uh, some other like people believe in other religions, and they have like a democratic setting or democratic political regime. um, Interpersonal trust, if you remember like some people that the some literature um, articulates or emphasizes this kind of relationship between culture and social capital and democracy. And again, it's not like according to he used like Wood Value survey and compare like the Muslim countries with other countries, and there is no kind of substantial difference between the Muslim countries and others. So these variables cannot offer plausible explanation to establish this causal effect between um, X and Y, between like Islam and authoritarianism. um, he tried to introduce one element about subordination of how patriarchy or the subordination of women in Muslim society would be an important or essential element for provisional theory. To be like he, in order to formulate kind of different hypotheses, in order to he actually ran regressions, and the you're going to learn how to read regression paper this week. And the variables are statistically significant, and the results are kind of robust. I'm gonna explain this later. But it needs further examination in order to have like a theory linking subordination of women or the status of women in Muslim societies and authoritarianism or democratic deficit or lack of democracy in these societies. So what kind of measurement he offered for the dependent variable? So he needs to examine the relationship between Islam and democracy or authoritarianism, okay, or like democratic deficit. So the explanatory variable is like Islamic culture or Islamic traditions. And the X and the Y here, the outcome variable or the dependent variable is democracy or the lack of democracy. So how he introduced, how he managed to quantify, this variable from already existing, data set. So he has actually to define, what democracy means first. So firstly, he defines democracy, or he limited democracy as to the formal dimension or the formal procedural dimension, as Robert Dahl mentioned, polyarchy, because it's very difficult, to achieve democracy. So it's much more beneficial or practical to focus on the two dimensions, the electoral competition and participation in terms of like, the freedom of association. In order to measure this, in order to quantify, the concept, in order to he already defined it, and he formed, defined the democratic deficit in a sense of lack of participation and electoral competition. And then he tried to measure this by using Freedom House or a scale on civil and political rights. So according to this, you have the link here. So the Freedom House actually, they have like this scale from for in order to measure like civil and political rights. So they have this scale from 1 to 7. So the higher the rate actually, or the higher the score of the country, so the less freedom the country is. So that's why he had to reverse, this scale. He has to rescale it in order. So the higher the country, like the 7 here, it means the country is authoritarian. It has like less kind of political, less guarantees or for political and civil rights. So he has like to reverse it in order to make sure like the higher the rate, the greater, the openness in a particular country. And he had like, this, he focused mainly on particular, time point. So 10-year average between 1991 till 2001. He used a different, measure or different, data set in order to make sure that the results, will hold if he uses different kind of data set or different measurement of the same variable. So it's a polity project that it has like the scale from 10 to -10. So 10 is like the most democratic, and -10 is the autocratic country. And he used like this, he focused mainly on this time point of 8-year average between 1991 and 1998. And he tried to be clear about, what types of, or what kind of problems or limitations, the research design he came up with, actually the research design has different kind of problems. So that's why he had to articulate or to highlight, these limitations. He mentioned that in order to measure, some of the controls or the explanatory variable, so he resorted to this kind of dummies for structural and cultural and historical variables. So it's either like, it's amenable to this kind of 0 or 1, yes or no, or 0 or 1 variable. So we call it dummies. Like if you need to measure like, gender, for example, like female or male. So it's a 0 or 1, or like, some sort of like, the majority of the populations, are the vast majority of the population, or the percentage of the more than like 50% of the population is Muslim or non-Muslim. So it's kind of yes or no. So he did establish kind of a dummy variable in order to trace, or to measure these kind of variables. So it technically kind of eliminates, some variations, and it doesn't capture the complexity of these cultural or historical and structural variables. He tried to avoid this problem by focusing on countries with like more than 500,000 of population are Muslims, but it's not like it's not like a random sample. So there is a problem here, or there's a methodological caveat here of selection bias. And he didn't, opt for a random sample over a long period of time. So that's why the findings are limited, to this limited period of time. So in his words, I cannot extend, inferences from my sample to the world at other times. So he highlighted the limitation about the measurement and the extension of the time period. For the independent variable, as I mentioned, he focused on the countries with the predominant Islamic tradition, and he traced, he constructed a dummy in order to trace these countries. And for the controls, from the rival explanations or from the literature, he has to control for other variables. So he needs to examine the relationship between the independent and dependent variable, but there are other variables he needs to control for. And where does he he come up with these controls? From the literature. For example, like according to the literature, like the level of economic development is very essential to have like a democratic governance. Like modernization theory, like high level of economic growth would enable, democratic governance to sustain its rule, or a democratic government to sustain its rule. So in order to measure this, he opted for the GDP per capita in order to measure or to capture the economic development. And then another stream in the literature focuses on the sociocultural divisions, or the fractionalization, ethnic fractionalization. This would lead to or trigger kind of intercommunal violence within a given society, and this would make the society less receptive, to any democratic regime or any democratic governance. And then economic performance. According to this, the how to sustain high level of economic performance in order to prevent any kind of cross-class alliance from emerging and pressuring or challenging the existing governance. So in order to measure this economic governance, he opted for the average annual percentage growth of the GDP per capita in order to measure the change in the economic performance of the country. Because perhaps authoritarian regimes might sustain their power as long as they would offer high level of economic performance. And then from the literature as well, like the British colonial heritage and the communist heritage and resource abundance. According to the literature, the British colonial authority left kind of legacy because it offered, some degree of decentralization. I doubt, this applicable to all the or generalizable, to all the British, colonies, but it actually this trend in the literature he needs to control for. So it's kind of decentralization and how like the state didn't have like tight control over society. It left kind of democratic legacy that carried over the post-independence period. And then a communist heritage. He controlled for the communist heritage because of the literature. According to the literature, the former Soviet Union actually had like tight control over society. So these countries didn't have any experience in associational or free associational life. This would undermine the emergence of civil society in these countries. And this former Soviet republics might be like embedded into this authoritarian governance or authoritarian rule, more than like the religion being predominantly Muslim countries or Muslim societies. And then he created a dummy for the members of the organizations of petroleum exporting countries in order to control for the basically the oil rich countries, because according to these theories, people do not pay taxes to their governments. So these governments they rely mainly on the oil rents. So they don't face any kind of social pressures in order to make any kind of transition to democratic rule. So he Fish here controlled for sex variables or sex controls, and he came up with this like data sets from the World Bank or ethno-linguistic project that the project actually quantified the fractionalization from 0 to 1. 0 like represented the complete homogeneity in particular society, and 1 represents like the highest fragmentation or ethnic fractionalization in the society. But the index or the data set mainly here focus on the linguistic fractionalization or fragmentation in a society. So that's why he tried to use a different measure in order to capture to what extent like linguistic divisions might not lead to communal violence. Perhaps like more political or political ethnic divisions might lead to the eruption of these communal violence. So they need different measure or proxy for this ethnic fractionalization by focusing not only on or not on the languages or the linguistic differences, but the political and ethnic differences as like a particular ethnic composition or a percentage of the entire the ratio to the entire population. So he improved on this control later and used different measure in order to capture the socioeconomic, the socio-cultural divisions. Here you have like after like this is called like model specification, like what kind of variables we should include, what kind of measures or what kind of data sets we need to use in order to offer a more precise measure or to capture exactly or accurately the conceptual framework we need to measure or we need to examine. So here he has like this kind of he ran like a regression by using the Freedom House scores from 1 to 7 and using like the main explanatory variable is Islamic religious tradition, and he used a dummy variable. And then the controls, like the economic development, he used the log value of the GDP per capita. Sociocultural division, he used the ethno-linguistic fractionalization and index. And all the data, but some of the literature actually used or constructed already data sets on the economic development, like GDP per capita or growth of GDP per capita, or the World Bank data sets. And then the economic performance and the British colonial heritage, communal, and the oil-rich membership, the OPEC membership. And he created dummies in order to trace, these variables. So the only thing I was planning, like, to show you in class, how to run regression model using like Stata or any statistical package. But like for now, like, or because like, we moved, to this online classes or online teaching. So you need to learn, you cannot like end a methodology class without knowing how to read a regression table. So here you have like he used like a statistical program in order to run this regression. He actually constructed, a data set in order to run a statistical model, and he got these results. So according to the table here, Islamic religious tradition um, negatively related to or negatively correlated or associated with the Freedom House score. So the being or the Islamic religious, the society, which is like predominantly Muslims, the society that has the society that has like predominant Muslim population. It's a dummy here. It's like one. Um, it would decrease, the score of the Freedom House by 2.1. So there is kind of a negative relationship between Muslim societies being like, a society with Islamic religious tradition and the lower score of Freedom House, lower like, score on political and civil rights. And this is like, the 3 stars means like this is at like 90%. So you have here the p-values. It's 90% confidence level. So you are like, confident, about, this correlation, and confident about rejecting the null hypothesis. So here it's a negative relationship between Islamic religious tradition and the score, the Freedom House score or the democratic deficit at 90% confidence level. And this is related to the p-value of 0.001. For the economic development, there's a positive relationship between high level of GDP per capita, the log value of the GDP per capita, and the score of the civil and political Freedom House score at again like 90% confidence level. And there is a negative relationship between fractionalization. The society with like highly fractionalized society, they have like negative association with the democratic or the Freedom House score at 90% confidence level. And the British colonial heritage is positively associated with the Freedom House at again like the 90% confidence level. And the communist heritage, it's positively related, but it doesn't have like these like stars, like one or 2 or 3 stars. So it's not significant. So there is kind of a positive relationship, but it's not significant. So this is like, sorry, like the economic performance was positively associated with the Freedom House score, 0.20. And British colonial heritage, it's positive, but positively related or correlated, but it's not significant. It's not statistically significant. And communist heritage as well, not statistically significant. And the membership in the OPEC, it's negatively. There's a negative relationship between like economic resources and the Freedom House score. It's 1 point. It decreases by 1.91, and we call it at 90% confidence level. And he tried to run the same regression with the same variables, but he changed like the Freedom House score, and he used like for robustness check uh, polity scores on the same variables. The polity score from 10 to minus 10. And still the results, hold. Again, the Islamic religious tradition is the variable is negatively associated with the polity score. So the being like Muslim society, this would decrease the score, the polity score, meaning like you're approaching this autocratic or authoritarian regimes. At 90% confidence level, and the economic development is positively associated at the 90% confidence level with the 3 stars, and it increases the score, the polity score, by 1 unit increase in the log GDP per capita would increase the score by 4.34. For the fractionalization, the linguistic fractionalization index, this like highly fractionalized society, by approaching this kind of high fractionalization, would decrease the score, the polity score, by 6.88 at 90% confidence level. And the economic performance, like the change, the annual, the average of annual change as a percentage, the growth of the GDP per capita, this actually increases the polity score by 0.64, but this time 2 stars, at 95% confidence level. And again, the British colonial heritage and communist legacy heritage, they are positively associated with the polity score, but they are not significant. And the oil or the membership in the OPEC, negatively associated with the polity score. It decreases actually the polity score by 9.01 at 90% confidence level. So I can like give you more like training or exercises in like to train yourself in like reading regression tables, but this is like more or less how to read these kind of the results, any kind of findings of the statistical or regression model. But here he actually mentioned some issues on measurements. For example, like in his words, like GDP per capita is sometimes regarded as in a kind of, it's not like it's not like a good measure of economic development, inadequate measure of economic, in his own words. So I therefore also used an alternative measure, the size of the agrarian proportion of the population. So in order to capture or to examine the socioeconomic transformation, so GDP per capita perhaps is not like a good measure in order to capture this economic development or economic transformation. So by finding another measurement in order to examine the economic development by the percentage of the population that are employed in the agricultural sector or non-industrial sector. So meaning here he defines like economic development with kind of degree of or the level of industrialization. So the higher the percentage of the population employed in the agricultural sector, or the higher the proportion, perhaps like the lower the level of economic development. So he tried to find another measure in order to capture the economic development or the relationship between economic development and democracy. And ethnic homogeneity, as I mentioned again, he tried to use a different measure refined by Crane. According to you here have the link. So according to this measure, linguistic fractionalization or fractions do not correspond to intercommunal violence. Perhaps like this ethno-political fractions, are much more much more important than ethnic fractionalization, because like these kind of linguistic cleavages do not always correspond to these ethnic cleavages or ethnic violence. So the proportion of ethnicity groups to the entire or the total population might be much more precise, in order to capture, this kind of ethnic homogeneity or ethnic heterogeneity in a given society, and to what extent it would lead to eruption of intercommunal violence. And he used like new measures, and he ran the same regression. So, but instead of using like the World Bank data for the GDP per capita, he used, this measurement about the proportion of the population in agricultural sector, and he used another measure for ethnic homogeneity or ethnic fractionalization. And he ran like the same regression models, and he got the same findings, and that's why he reported that the findings are robust. So here again some issues about causal effect, or the causal mechanisms between Islam and authoritarianism. And he himself actually reported these methodological issues. For example, he mentioned like the dummy variable, the way he measured, Muslim societies, the measurement of using like dummy variables, like the half of the population or the majority of the population is Muslim, is not like, and saying yes or no, tracing this, using dummy by using yes or no. It's not like, it doesn't really, capture the effect of the Islamic traditions or Islam as a religion and regime type. And actually, back to the regression tables, the findings, he has got like other variables are statistically significant as well, like the economic performance or the economic development, using like the two measures, the GDP per capita and the proportion of the agricultural population the population employed in the agricultural sectors or activities. So actually he has like, an ethnic fractionalization as well. So he has like an resource abundance. So he has like so many variables that they are statistically significant as well. So how can we say like, or we single out the Islam, the Islamic tradition or the religion as the plausible explanation, for the regime type or for the democratic deficit in Muslim countries. So what he mentioned, like these kind of the variable might be a proxy, like the variable of like Muslim society or the religious Islamic traditions. This variable might be a proxy for other variables or other control variables that they are statistically significant as well in his statistical models. So so he actually posed this question, like, what kind of explanations, that would account for this connection or this link between Islam and authoritarianism. And these like other possible explanations cannot be ruled out based on the preceding quantitative analysis. So he got like, some statistical results, some robust findings by using different measures, by using different data sets, and he got the same like, correlation between the variables. But again, he was not able to rule out or any rival explanation or like any other possible explanations that make a link between economic performance and regime type, or ethnic composition or ethnic fractionalization and regime type. So how can we qualify, the religion or Islam as like explanatory variable would account for the outcome variable, which is like democratic deficit. So again, he tried to use like some statistical techniques in order to to have like this comparison between Muslim countries or Muslim societies and other mainly Catholic societies, in order to rule out, the variables that focus on violence or secular orientations or interpersonal distrust. And he introduced like a new variable, focuses on female or women subordination in Muslim societies. So he introduces like four main measures. The first one, like the difference between male and female literacy rate. If it's like, high rate, exists in between females, meaning like, there is kind of a discrimination against, societal kind of discrimination against, the females, because like the lower the degree of like educational attainment, or the higher the level of like, literacy, for example, this would affect, the career chances, for female in given society. So this would privilege or would give advantage to males over females. And the what he mentioned, like the sex ratio between like males and females. So the higher the level as well, like means like there's something hierarchical relationship. These kind of hierarchical relationships do exist in a society that would affect negatively the chances of the chances women have in given society, especially in Muslim societies. And he used like two other variables from the UNDP indicators, like the existence of women in high-ranking positions in executive branches, like in cabinet and sub-level, like, ministerial level and sub-ministerial levels. And then the economic status, in the workplace for women, and the presence, their presence in legislature. And the according to the UNDP, and he called it like the empowerment variable. So let's see how he ran like a regression using these like four indicators in order to measure the female subordination in Muslim societies, and what kind of results or findings he has got. So firstly, before running the regression, he made this comparison between Muslim countries and Catholic countries using the same four variables. For the literacy gap, there is kind of a substantial difference between Muslim countries and Catholic countries. For Muslim countries, the literacy gap reached 19.7. For Catholic, 4.3. And for the sex ratio, like the mean number of males per 100 females, it's still like there's no like a big difference, but it's still Muslim countries, score high or higher than the Catholic countries. And for the existence of or the percentage of the ministerial and sub-ministerial officials in Muslim countries, like account for 5.2, comparing to Catholic countries that actually they reach like 12.2, the mean percent of ministerial and sub-ministerial officials for women. And gender empowerment measure for Muslim countries 0.22 and 0.5 or in Catholic countries. This like the existence or the presence in the legislative bodies, and the like the status of women in workplaces. So actually there is kind of a clear difference between Muslim countries and Catholic countries. If you go back to the article, he didn't get the same like substantial differences between Muslim and Catholic countries with regard to other variables like the interpersonal trust and secular orientation, but he has got this kind of substantial differences between Muslim countries and Catholic countries with regard to the variables or the breakdowns, he constructed in order to measure the women's subordination. And here he ran the regression, different models, using different using different variables in order to see to what extent the Muslim women subordination would account for a democratic deficit, or when he actually plugged these variables in the model, what kind of results he got in terms of the correlation between these indicators or these variables and the Freedom House score. So again, he ran the same model with the economic development. It's still like positively and statistically significant, positively related or correlated with the Freedom House score. So the higher the level of economic development, the higher the score the country would get on civil and political rights. Is statistically significant at different like confidence level. And Islamic religious tradition still like negatively, the relationship holds and negatively correlated with the Freedom House score. So the Islamic religious tradition, these traditions are negatively associated with the freedom, with the democratic level or the degree of openness in particular societies. And the literacy gap here, you have like he ran like model 2 and with the literacy gap, and then the sex ratio in model 4, and then model 6, the presence or the woman in government, and then gender empowerment measure in model 8. For the literacy gap, it's negatively associated and statistically significant with the score of the Freedom House, and at 95%, and then the sex ratio negatively associated with the Freedom House score as well. It actually, the higher the ratio, the lower the score by 0.06 at 90% confidence level. And for the presence or the existence or the admission of women in ministerial post or executive positions, it actually positively correlated or associated with the score, the Freedom House score, at 0.08%. It would increase, the score by 0.08 at 90% confidence level. And then the gender empowerment measure, like the woman in the workplace and the existence or the presence in legislature, it would actually increase the Freedom House score and positively correlated with the degree of openness or the level of civil and political rights by 3.32 at 90% confidence level. They have like here model 8, they have only 1 star. But here we need like I need to highlight some issue here, like with and actually he reported this as well, like especially the 2 UNP, the 2 indicators by UNP, women in government and gender empowerment and gender empowerment measures. There is a problem here. It might be a problem of, again, like a problem of indigeneity. Like here, let me explain it simply. Like the conditions by regime type, or actually, like, the democratic regimes actually provide the basis or better basis for improvement of the position of women. So it's conditioned by the status or the position of women is kind of conditioned by regime type, because democracies actually would affect rather than the opposite way around. It's not like, the existence of the woman in the cabinet or in the legislature would push for or would increase the democratic chances, or would, like, the like put pressures, or would challenge the autocratic or authoritarian regime in order to introduce democratic rule. It could be like the opposite way around, like in the existence of democratic regime actually help out with the improvement of the women situation. He actually reported this, but he ran like another like statistical analysis, and the relationship between, or the correlation between, like these variables or these indicators and the Freedom House score, the relationships hold. So that's why he was like he introduced these kind of elements in order to be in order to be examined kind of further in future researches. And he actually mentioned, like, some other issues regarding to what extent, like, women do really want this kind of treatment. Perhaps this is the situation, but it doesn't mean, like, it's kind of a subordination. Maybe some other variables would account for the reproduction of the same situation, regardless of, like, the admission or the acceptability of women in order to be treated this way. And he mentioned, like, this kind of thorny matter is far beyond the scope of his discussion. But he actually highlighted this methodological issue of endogeneity, and he still, like, admits that we need more explanations, or we need more analysis, or more explanatory variable, in order to have this causal to have, like, this causal dynamics that link that would establish a link between these indicators of women subordination to regime type or authoritarianism in the Middle East. And he actually introduced some interesting ideas about what kind of the promise some sociological researchers and psychological and sociological researchers might have. For example, like the variable he introduced about the literacy percentage or rate, this would be a proxy for the dominant position, or this male-female relation inside a family. Because, like, in Muslim countries, they have this hierarchical relationship with high position of father, and this kind of male-female relationship might be replicated in a broader society. So they might, sociologists, or sociological institutionalists, most especially, they might establish this relationship between family and polity, although it's not, like, clear, or still, like, it actually triggers more debates about the level of analysis and the relationship between this family and polity, and we don't have, like, clear evidence about this hierarchical relationship that would be kind of replicated in a broader society, or would be mirrored in the entire society. But this connection between family relationship and this hierarchical relationship and the position of man within a family shouldn't be ignored. Like, sociologists might like develop some methodological tools in order to establish this kind of relationship between family and polity, and how it would replicate itself, or to, like, to play itself out differently in a society, in a different level of analysis. And for sociologists as well, he suggested that, like, there some initial, like, explanations, or some initial explanations might focus on the authoritarian attitudes of men, and how, like, men are like they are kind of more conducive to this authoritarian attitudes than women, because they are more inclined to this social dominance. They have, like, this social dominance orientation compared to women, that women actually they are much more they have like this propensity to consensus building, and they actually avoid any kind of violent or extremist politics. So there is kind of implicit hypothesis here, like he needs to advance that women are much more democratic, and by preventing or precluding them from like advancing their educational or gaining kind of a level of educational attainment to advance their chances in public life, this would actually add a problem to democratic deficit, or to perpetuate or to reproduce the same authoritarian governance or rule. And again, like, when he mentioned something about, like, perhaps it's not related, like, being like, in Islamic traditions, maybe it has nothing to do with the interpretation of the text, or the scripture or the Quran. Perhaps it has more to do, like, people are stuck in kind of traditional interpretation, or patriarchal kind of interpretation, and social and psychological orientation. But he introduced still, like, still the fact that, like, these kind of Muslim societies, or the Islamic traditions are related to, or the women subordination is related to, is pretty much embedded into, or Muslim societies or Muslim traditions, and it's pretty much related or correlated significantly and statistically related to low score of democratic level, or low score of civil and political rights. And this would be like potential avenues for psychological and sociological research in the region. So you guys need to you have, like, one exercise. So you need to think about like, what kind of methodological tools, or what kind of other measurements we might come up with in order to bear on this subject, like woman subordination and regime type or authoritarianism. I would say, like, for example, like, if you, the counterfactual thing is like, what would have happened if the cause here, like, the Islamic tradition has been absent. So if we think about a case, not only, perhaps it's not a country, like, particular, like, association or organization in a country, or cross countries, they might believe in, like, in different, tradition. So if we might have, like, the same outcome, or we might see something different. Like, for example, like, if they don't, like, believe in this kind of Islamic tradition, and we need to see, like, if the absence of this cause would lead to, or actually led to, different outcome, like, democratic regime, even within, like, organizational structure or not. So this might be, like, a potential research question. For example, if you focus on like the organizational structure of secular parties, or in a secular country that they don't actually buy into this Islamic tradition. I'm not sure if we have, like, in the region here, apart from Tunisia, perhaps would be like a very, like, interesting candidate, or a very interesting case in order to examine. So we need to know, like, the it's kind of a Muslim country, but they don't actually, like, we need to examine to what extent, this analytical framework would be applied, and if we can think about, different other variables in order to come up with a different research design. perhaps like non-quantitative research design. And this is like related to the last point, I need to highlight or to point out. So perhaps he didn't mention something about like, feminism or Islam. It's kind of an oxymoron. That's why he mentioned like, I'm not qualified to comment on whether women really want, the treatment. Perhaps like, some human rights, groups, they would have like different discourse, and that's why, he didn't subject this to his quantitative analysis. So think about like, the different research design that might tackle, this the point he tried to make. And this is related to the conceptual and the relationship between large and small n study or case studies. And there is always like, a trade-off, and advantages and disadvantages, and we need to make use, and it all depends on the question we need to, or the puzzle we need to offer an answer to. So I also recommend like, the Coppage piece on thickening thin concepts and theories, combining large n and small n in comparative politics. So the point here, it's quantitative analysis. There is always, as I mentioned, like, a trade-off. So you can pay attention to nuances, or to come up with like, you can be faithful, to this kind of thickening thick concepts or rich concepts, but this would come at the expense of the generalization and cumulation, kind of. So what does he mean by thin and thick concepts? Thin concepts, it's this is what quantitative analysis or measures, actually interested in. So the concepts are simple and clear and objective, kind of. So that's why it could be measurable. So the unpack, and measure. They make like, these kind of observable elements, or testable element, testable dimension, kind of measurable. So that's why they need like, thin or simple concept or simple elements to be measurable or to be quantifiable. But we deal all the time with multidimensional concepts like, legitimacy, democracy, stability, development, authoritarianism. So it's very difficult. The Coppage mentioned like these concepts are thick in two sides, in like, in a sense, like these concepts cannot be reduced to a single indicator. So it's very difficult to reduce it to one dimension or one element without losing meaning. Like universal suffrage and competitiveness, people might have like, legally they might have like, the state might allow for extensive suffrage, but it doesn't say anything about, the level of competitiveness, for example. So that's why they are not reducible to the second point in this thickness thing. These concepts are multidimensional, so it's very difficult to reduce one element or one dimension to the other one. So if you have like, universal suffrage, it doesn't say, anything about competitiveness. Okay. So like small n studies or case studies, they actually they might excel at, this kind of conceptual complexity, like capturing this kind of conceptual complexity in order to come up with more complex or valid measure, to establish like new theoretical framework, or to have like, more theoretical innovation, and to be much more sensitive again to the level of analysis. For example, like here in the article we examined, what kind of we talk about like some sort of like, it's not like the micro level, but it's kind of to what extent, like, the family, the woman, the interaction between different family members would affect, the polity structure, for example. So here it's kind of meso and macro level of analysis. So small n or non-large n study actually would correspond properly to this kind of complexity, in order to be sensitive to this complex conditions or complex causality, because like they do believe, like people like, they do like this kind of qualitative research, qualitative research design. They are sensitive to this interlinkedness between, or interconnectedness between different levels of analysis, because they are this kind of complexity of the interconnectedness between the levels of analysis, how they are kind of intertwined, different levels. They are much more, they are closer to how the real world actually functions, or how the real world works. So small, like researchers, or small n actually um, deals better, with these kind of complexities, in order, or complex multidimensional hypotheses, in order to advance new concepts, or to advance new theories using inductive logic. So the exercise you have here, I'm still like, I'm just thinking like you about, like, different kind of research designs using non-qualitative methods. So what kind of quantitative research, what kind of qualitative research design we can come up with, in order to examine, this relationship between patriarchy, or the woman subordination, and authoritarianism. And let's focus on the MENA region, like the Middle East and North Africa region, not the entire Muslim societies. Um, so I might have like I need to give like another lecture, but it's very difficult actually to run a seminar, in non-interactive way. So what I'm thinking about, like, top possible solutions. Um, so you have already 3 questions from the last lecture. So I left like half an hour from the seminar for you, in order to answer the questions, I posed in the last slide. So we will have like online discussion, or like online forum on Moodle about, these questions. And this is, as I mentioned, this is part of your participation, the grades, about your participation grades. And here you can think about like this qualitative research design regarding, the issue about, most of you are interested in gender and political participation. So it's very much related to, or it falls into, the domain of interest. So you might think about, different alternative research designs that might cover this relationship between religion and the Muslim support, the women's subordination in Muslim societies, and authoritarianism. And I'll give like I need to read the literature review, and I might have another lecture. I'll base it on like the research designs, the potential research designs you might follow based on the literature review you submitted. Hopefully I can do this before next Wednesday. So we will have like these, I'll post an announcement on Moodle, and we'll probably will have like this online forum next week, after like, they mentioned like, we shouldn't, have these kind of online discussions before the 2 weeks. And now we can have like online forum perhaps by Sunday or something, at the same time of the lecture. So I'll post announcement on Moodle, and I'll ask, Dina, the TA, to get in touch with you. In the meantime, if you have any question, please let me know. So bye.